The morning Karen Whitmore marched across our pristine marble courtyard in her crisp white tennis outfit, that predatory gleam in her ice blue eyes told me someone was about to get the full Platinum Heights HOA treatment. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that signature power ponytail that screamed suburban authority, and she clutched her leather-bound violation clipboard like a weapon of mass destruction. The way her white athletic bralette and matching tennis skirt practically glowed in the Miami sunshine should have been a warning sign that storm clouds were gathering over our peaceful community. My name is Sebastian Torres, and I'm the personal assistant to the greatest footballer who ever lived, Lionel Messi. You know him as the Argentine magician who won 8 Ballon d'Or trophies, led his country to World Cup glory in Qatar, and redefined what it means to be perfect with a football at your feet. What you might not know is that Leo bought a stunning $10.8 million waterfront mansion in Platinum Heights, specifically because the gated community promised privacy, security, and the kind of elite atmosphere where world-class athletes could train and relax without interference. We were catastrophically wrong about that last part. Leo had been living in Platinum Heights for exactly 4 months when Karen decided his private training facility was a community menace. The custom-built futsal court in his backyard where he practiced his legendary free kicks and worked on ball control drills that made grown men weep, was apparently creating what Karen termed excessive noise pollution and inappropriate commercial athletic activity in a residential zone. But the real crime in Karen's suburban paradise was Leo's trophy display. The 2022 FIFA World Cup gleaming gold in his floor-to-ceiling living room window where the afternoon Miami sun would catch its surface and create what Leo called a reminder of dreams achieved through dedication. The trophy sat on a custom mahogany display case, surrounded by his collection of Ballon d'Or awards, Champions League medals, and the Argentina captain's armband from that magical night in Doha. Karen called it excessive reflective decoration and attention-seeking behavior that violated community aesthetic standards. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning while Leo was at the Inter Miami training facility, working with his new teammates and probably creating magic that would end up on SportsCenter highlight reels. I opened the thick envelope in his study, surrounded by framed jerseys from Barcelona, PSG, and Argentina, along with photographs of Leo embracing his wife Antonella and their 3 boys after the World Cup final. The letter was printed on paper so expensive it probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but the contents read like suburban dictator fiction written by someone who'd never seen a football match in their life. Dear Mr. Messi, the Platinum Heights Homeowners Association has received numerous complaints regarding unauthorized recreational facility construction and excessive decorative displays that create safety hazards and aesthetic violations within our prestigious community. Your backyard athletic installation generates noise levels exceeding residential decibel limits during morning and evening hours, while your prominent window trophy display creates dangerous glare conditions that interfere with pedestrian safety and vehicular traffic flow. I had to read it 3 times to process the sheer audacity. Karen Whitmore, HOA president of a community where monthly fees could buy a luxury car, was demanding that the greatest player in football history remove his World Cup trophy from his own living room because it was too shiny, and dismantle the training facility where he maintained the fitness that had carried Argentina to glory. The letter continued with typical HOA bureaucratic warfare about community standards and noise ordinances, but the deadline was pure suburban terrorism. Leo had 48 hours to remove his unauthorized athletic facility and excessive reflective displays or face $1,000 daily fines until the violations were corrected. But here's where Karen made her first catastrophic miscalculation. She was messing with a man who'd spent his entire career overcoming impossible challenges, who turned heartbreak in 4 Copa America finals into the fuel that powered Argentina's World Cup triumph, and who had the financial resources to hire legal teams that could make HOA bylaws disappear faster than his free kicks found the top corner. I called Leo immediately. He was in the gym at the training facility, probably working on the core strength that kept him competitive against players half his age. When I read him Karen's demands, the silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Sebastian, he finally said in that quiet voice that his teammates knew meant business, this woman wants me to remove the World Cup from my house. That's exactly what she's demanding, Leo. She says it creates glare issues. Another pause. Then I heard something I'd rarely experienced in 5 years as his assistant, Lionel Messi laughing. Not the polite chuckle he used during press conferences, but genuine incredulous laughter that echoed through the training facility. Sebastian, I have played in World Cup finals, Champions League finals, Copa America finals. I have faced the best defenders in the world, dealt with the most hostile crowds imaginable, and overcome pressure that would break most people. His voice carried that steel edge that opposing defenders learned to fear. This HOA woman thinks she can intimidate me because my trophy is too bright. But Karen wasn't finished with her suburban assault. While I was researching Florida HOA law and discovering that her demands had about as much legal weight as a tissue paper contract, she escalated to phase 2 of her campaign, social pressure through community manipulation. The Nextdoor app exploded with Karen's carefully crafted propaganda, posts about inappropriate noise levels disrupting family dinners, and excessive showboating that violated community values flooded the neighborhood's social media feeds. She organized what she called Concerned Citizens for Community Standards, complete with official-looking letterhead and a petition demanding the immediate removal of commercial athletic facilities from residential properties. But Karen's masterstroke was the photo campaign. She positioned herself outside Leo's property with a professional photographer, capturing images of his modest training setup from angles that made it look like a commercial sports complex. The Argentina flags flying proudly in his garden were cropped to appear oversized and intrusive. Even his son's soccer goals in the side yard were labeled as unauthorized sports equipment. The Miami Herald picked up the story 3 days later. World Cup winner faces HOA battle over backyard training facility. Ran on the sports page with a photo of Karen standing in her pristine white tennis outfit, arms crossed, looking like she was protecting suburban civilization from the chaos of athletic excellence. Mr. Messi is certainly entitled to enjoy his success, Karen told the reporter with that syrupy sweetness that barely concealed her predatory instincts. But Platinum Heights is a family community with standards. We can't have residents treating their properties like professional sports facilities. The noise, the traffic, the ostentatious displays, it's simply not appropriate for our refined neighborhood. The article included quotes from anonymous residents who complained about constant ball-kicking sounds and intimidating foreign flags that made them feel unwelcome in their own community. Reading between the lines, it was obvious Karen had orchestrated a whisper campaign designed to make Leo feel isolated and unwelcome. But here's what Karen didn't understand about Lionel Messi. The man who'd spent his career proving doubters wrong, who'd overcome growth hormone deficiency as a child and criticism about his international career as an adult, wasn't about to be intimidated by a suburban HOA president with delusions of authority. Leo's response was swift and characteristically brilliant. Instead of hiding or backing down, he invited the entire Platinum Heights community to a backyard barbecue and soccer clinic for the neighborhood children. The invitation, personally signed by the World Cup winner, arrived at every house in the development on beautiful cardstock that probably cost more than Karen's monthly violation citations. Dear neighbors, I would be honored to welcome you to my home this Saturday for an afternoon of friendship, food, and football. Please bring your children for complimentary soccer instruction and join me in celebrating the beautiful game that has brought me so much joy. Together we can build the community spirit that makes neighborhoods truly special. With respect and excitement, Leo Messi. The RSVP responses flooded in faster than Leo's goals against Bayern Munich. Families who'd been quietly enduring Karen's tyrannical HOA enforcement suddenly had permission to embrace something authentic and joyful. Children who'd grown up watching Leo's highlights on YouTube would get to learn from the master himself. Karen's reaction was immediate and predictable. An emergency HOA board meeting was called for Friday night, complete with agenda items about unauthorized community events and liability concerns regarding unlicensed athletic instruction. She sent violation notices to residents who'd publicly RSVP'd, threatening fines for participation in non-approved community gatherings. But her nuclear option was calling the Miami-Dade County Licensing Department, claiming Leo was operating an unauthorized sports training facility and instruction business without proper permits. The complaint alleged commercial athletic activity in a residential zone, tax evasion through unreported coaching income, and public safety violations due to inadequate insurance coverage. Friday morning, 2 county inspectors arrived at Leo's front gate with clipboards and measuring equipment, ready to investigate reports of illegal commercial sports operations. They found Leo in his backyard, juggling a football with the casual perfection that had mesmerized the world for 2 decades, his 3 sons laughing as they tried to replicate his rainbow flicks and stepovers. Mr. Messi, the lead inspector said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who clearly felt ridiculous about the situation, we've received complaints about commercial sports instruction being conducted on residential property. Leo stopped juggling, caught the ball with his right foot, and flicked it up to his hands with the kind of touch that defied physics. Gentlemen, welcome to my home. I am teaching my sons to play football in our backyard. Is this now illegal in Miami? The inspection lasted 15 minutes. What they found was a modest training area smaller than most community tennis courts, sound levels well within residential limits even during active use, and no commercial signage, equipment, or evidence of business operations. The excessive noise Karen had reported was quieter than most suburban lawn mowing activities. "Sir," the inspector concluded, "there are no violations here. You're entitled to recreational use of your private property. As for tomorrow's event, hosting neighbors for a barbecue is protected residential activity." But Karen wasn't finished. That evening's emergency HOA meeting revealed the true scope of her desperation. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled "Protecting Platinum Heights Property Values from Commercial Athletic Exploitation" that would have been hilarious if it weren't so maliciously crafted. Slide after slide showed Leo's training area from deceptive angles, making his regulation-size futsal court look like a professional stadium. She'd calculated theoretical noise levels during peak training hours that assumed constant high-intensity activity. Most damaging, she'd researched property values in neighborhoods near professional sports facilities, claiming Leo's presence would attract undesirable sports tourism that would destroy the community's exclusive atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen announced to the packed community center, her white tennis outfit practically glowing under the fluorescent lights as she gripped her presentation remote like a weapon, "we must protect our investment. Mr. Messi's activities are transforming our refined residential community into a commercial sports destination. Property values are at risk. Our children's safety is compromised. The very character of Platinum Heights hangs in the balance." The room was divided. Longtime residents who'd bought into Karen's vision of suburban perfection nodded grimly, while newer families with soccer-playing children looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of her presentation. Then came Karen's masterstroke of manipulative genius. She'd invited a property values expert who testified that celebrity athlete residences often decreased surrounding home values due to increased traffic, media attention, and sports-related disruptions. The expert, a real estate agent from Karen's country club, presented charts and graphs that painted Leo's presence as an existential threat to their community's financial future. "The data is clear," the expert concluded. "Professional athletes bring chaos. Training activities, media coverage, fan attention. These factors consistently depress residential property values in even the most exclusive communities." But here's what Karen didn't anticipate. Among the audience sat Maria Santos, a local sports journalist who'd covered Leo's arrival in Miami and had been quietly documenting Karen's campaign for what was becoming a much larger story about HOA overreach and anti-immigrant sentiment in Florida's luxury communities. Maria's article in the Miami Herald the next morning changed everything. HOA president wages war against World Cup hero included photos of Karen's presentation, quotes from the property values expert, and a detailed breakdown of the legal and ethical problems with Karen's campaign. But the real bombshell was Maria's investigation into Karen's background. The woman who was crusading against inappropriate foreign influences had herself been cited by the Florida Department of Business Regulation for discriminatory rental practices in her previous community management role. She'd been accused of systematically targeting Hispanic families for HOA violations while ignoring identical issues in homes owned by white residents. Saturday morning dawned clear and perfect, with gentle ocean breezes carrying the scent of salt air and the sound of children's laughter toward Leo's backyard. By 10 a.m., over 60 neighbors had gathered for what would become the most magical afternoon in Platinum Heights history. Leo emerged from his house wearing a simple Inter-Miami training shirt and shorts, carrying an Argentina football and that quiet smile that had charmed interviews for 2 decades. What followed was 3 hours of pure joy that reminded everyone why football is called the beautiful game. Children who'd only seen Leo on television found themselves receiving personal instruction from the greatest player who ever lived. He demonstrated the techniques that had mystified defenders for 20 years, patiently correcting form and encouraging effort. Parents watched in amazement as their shy, awkward kids gained confidence under Leo's gentle guidance. The afternoon's highlight came when Leo brought out the 2022 World Cup trophy. Children lined up to take photos with the golden prize, their faces glowing with wonder and excitement. Parents captured videos of their kids holding the same trophy Leo had lifted in Doha, creating memories that would last lifetimes. But the most powerful moment was when Leo addressed the gathered community. Standing in his backyard with the World Cup gleaming in the afternoon sun, he spoke about the importance of dreams, dedication, and community support. "In Argentina, we say that football is life, but life is also football," he said in his soft-spoken English, his accent carrying the warmth of someone who'd learned the language through love rather than obligation. Today you have welcomed my family into your community. Your children have shown me that football truly is universal. This is why I play, not for trophies or records, but for moments like this. Karen was notably absent from the celebration, but her presence was felt through the 3 security cameras she'd positioned to monitor the event from her property. Later investigation would reveal she'd spent the afternoon documenting attendees, photographing license plates, and preparing violation notices for residents who'd participated in what she termed unauthorized commercial sports instruction. The social media explosion began immediately. Videos of Leo teaching children, photos of families with the World Cup trophy, and stories about the greatest footballer in history hosting a neighborhood barbecue went viral across every platform. Messi Miami and Platinum Heights Party trended nationally as sports fans around the world celebrated the beautiful gesture, but the coverage that would ultimately destroy Karen's campaign came from an unexpected source. TMZ obtained security footage from Leo's property showing the exact moment Karen had positioned her cameras and the calculated way she documented the family gathering. The footage revealed her standing in her white tennis outfit, furiously taking notes while children laughed and played in the background. The optics were devastating. A successful, wealthy woman in pristine athletic wear, systematically surveilling a family barbecue where the world's greatest footballer was teaching children to play soccer. The image perfectly captured the absurdity and mean-spiritedness of her campaign. Sunday morning brought the Miami Herald's follow-up story, HOA President Under Fire for Surveilling Messi Family Event. The article included the security footage, quotes from attending families who praised Leo's generosity, and legal experts who questioned the ethics and legality of Karen's surveillance tactics. But Karen's response to the public relations disaster revealed the true depth of her obsession. Instead of backing down or attempting damage control, she doubled down with a press release that would become the smoking gun in her own destruction. The Platinum Heights HOA stands firm in protecting our community standards, her statement read, regardless of celebrity status or media manipulation. Mr. Messi's violation of our noise ordinances, architectural guidelines, and residential use restrictions cannot be excused simply because he has achieved athletic success. We will not allow our refined community to be transformed into a sports tourism destination. The statement continued with language that revealed the xenophobic undertones of her campaign. Platinum Heights residents chose this community for its American values and peaceful atmosphere. We cannot permit foreign sports culture to override the standards that make our neighborhood special. The backlash was immediate and devastating. Civil rights organizations condemned the statement's thinly veiled discrimination. Sports fans organized boycotts of Karen's property management company. Local politicians distanced themselves from her positions. But the death blow came from an unexpected source, the Platinum Heights residents themselves. Led by the families who'd attended Leo's barbecue, a petition drive began to remove Karen from her HOA presidency. Within 48 hours, they'd gathered signatures from over 70% of the community, demanding an emergency vote on her leadership. The final count was 127 votes for removal, 23 votes to retain Karen, and 15 abstentions. After 6 years of ruling Platinum Heights with an iron fist disguised as community standards, Karen Whitmore was finished. But Leo's victory was about more than defeating an overzealous HOA president. The weekend had created genuine community bonds that would last for years. Children who'd learned from the master continued practicing in their own backyards. Parents who'd connected over their kids' shared joy began organizing regular family gatherings. Most importantly, Leo had transformed a community that had been ruled by fear into one governed by joy. Where Karen had seen violations and disruptions, Leo had found opportunities for connection and shared celebration. As I watched Leo that Sunday evening, sitting on his back patio with Antonella and their boys, the World Cup trophy catching the last rays of Miami sunshine through the living room window, I realized something profound had happened. This wasn't just about defeating an HOA Karen or protecting property rights. It was about the power of authentic human connection to overcome the forces that seek to divide us. Karen had tried to use rules and regulations to exclude and intimidate. Leo had responded with invitation and inclusion. She'd weaponized community standards. He'd created community spirit. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or the outcome more decisive. But as I would soon discover, Karen's removal from the HOA presidency was just the beginning of her downfall. The woman who tried to silence the world's greatest footballer was about to learn what happens when your suburban tyranny gets exposed to global scrutiny. The real reckoning was just beginning. The Monday morning after the community barbecue, Miami exploded. What started as a neighborhood dispute had transformed into a global phenomenon that would ultimately destroy not just one HOA president's career, but expose the systemic corruption that had been festering in Platinum Heights for years. I arrived at Leo's house at 7 a.m. to find him in his kitchen, sipping mate and scrolling through his phone with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. The kitchen table was covered with newspapers. The Miami Herald, USA Today, even the New York Times had picked up the story. Each headline was more incredulous than the last. World Cup winner battles HOA over backyard soccer ran across the front page of the sports section. Messi versus Miami HOA. When community standards meet global icons dominated the local news. But the headline that made Leo laugh out loud was from a British tabloid. Blonde Karen declares war on football god. Sebastian, Leo said, setting down his phone and gesturing to the media circus brewing outside our gates. I have played in El Clasico at the Bernabeu with 100,000 people screaming. I have faced penalty shootouts in World Cup finals, but I have never experienced anything quite like this. Outside, news vans lined the normally pristine streets of Platinum Heights. Reporters with expensive haircuts and perfect teeth stood in front of our property, delivering breathless updates about the ongoing Messi HOA scandal to audiences around the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd complained about unwanted attention was now the focal point of international media scrutiny. But the real fireworks were happening online. Social media had turned the story into a cultural phenomenon that transcended sports. Messi-gate was trending globally, with millions of people sharing their own HOA horror stories and expressing outrage at the treatment of football's greatest player. The TikTok videos were particularly brutal for the HOA president. Clips of children from Saturday's barbecue learning from Leo had been viewed over 20 million times. But the video that went truly viral was security footage someone had leaked, showing the blonde woman in her white tennis outfit positioning surveillance cameras to monitor a children's soccer clinic. The contrast was devastating. Joyful kids learning from their hero while being secretly filmed by someone who looked like she was coordinating a covert operation against neighborhood happiness. Instagram was flooded with photos from Saturday's event. Parents had shared images of their children holding the World Cup trophy, learning from Leo and experiencing pure joy. Each post carried captions expressing gratitude for Leo's generosity and disbelief at the HOA's treatment of their family. But Twitter was where the real cultural analysis took place. Sports journalists, celebrities, and even politicians weighed in on what many were calling a perfect example of American suburban xenophobia disguised as community standards. When you try to silence the greatest footballer in history because his trophy is too shiny, you've lost the plot entirely, tweeted a prominent sports columnist. This isn't about noise ordinances or property values. This is about power, control, and the American suburbs' eternal war against anything that doesn't fit their narrow definition of normal. The international perspective was even more damning. European sports media portrayed the story as quintessentially American. A bureaucratic suburban princess attempting to regulate genius because it didn't conform to her vision of residential perfection. Only in America, wrote a columnist for The Guardian, could the world's greatest footballer be harassed by someone whose greatest achievement is being elected president of a homeowners association. The level of entitlement required to demand that Lionel Messi hide his World Cup trophy is breathtakingly American. But the coverage that would prove most dangerous to the HOA president came from investigative journalists who'd begun digging into her background and the financial operations of Platinum Heights. Maria Santos, the Miami Herald reporter who'd first exposed the story, had spent the weekend investigating the HOA's finances and discovered irregularities that made Leo's trophy display seem like the least of anyone's problems. Her Monday morning exposé was devastating. Platinum Heights HOA, missing funds and discriminatory enforcement patterns revealed. The investigation revealed that over $340,000 in HOA reserve funds had been transferred to questionable consulting contracts over the past 2 years. The consulting company, Peninsula Property Services, was owned by the HOA president's brother-in-law and had no employees, equipment, or track record of successful projects. But the pattern of discriminatory enforcement was even more damning. Maria had obtained 3 years' worth of violation notices and discovered that Hispanic families received citations at a rate 300% higher than white residents for identical infractions. Properties owned by single mothers were targeted for violations that were ignored when they occurred in homes owned by married couples. The data painted a picture of systematic discrimination disguised as community standards enforcement. Leo wasn't being targeted because of noise ordinances or aesthetic concerns. He was being harassed because a xenophobic HOA president saw his success and visibility as a threat to her vision of suburban homogeneity. The legal implications were staggering. Civil rights attorneys immediately recognized the pattern as textbook housing discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. Federal investigators began informal inquiries into the HOA's practices. Insurance companies started reviewing their liability exposure for communities with documented discriminatory enforcement patterns. But the woman in white tennis attire wasn't finished with her suburban warfare campaign. Instead of retreating in the face of mounting evidence and international criticism, she doubled down with a strategy that would ultimately seal her fate. Tuesday morning brought a new certified letter to Leo's house, this one even more audacious than the first. The HOA board had apparently held an emergency meeting and voted to implement what they called enhanced community standards for high-profile residents. The new regulations were clearly crafted to target Leo specifically, while maintaining a veneer of general applicability. Residents whose professional activities generate media attention or public interest must obtain HOA approval for any recreational activities that might attract visitors, media coverage, or community attention. The rules continued with Kafkaesque precision. Trophy displays visible from public areas must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee to ensure compatibility with community aesthetic standards. Recreational equipment that produces noise levels exceeding normal residential activities requires acoustic impact assessments and neighbor approval. The letter demanded that Leo apply for retroactive approval of his media-generating activities and submit to acoustic testing of his backyard training sessions. Failure to comply would result in $2,000 daily fines and potential legal action to force compliance with community standards. I read the letter to Leo while he stretched after his morning training session, his face transitioning from amusement to something I'd rarely seen in our 5 years together, genuine anger. "Sebastian, this woman is trying to regulate my existence because I am successful," he said, his usually calm voice carrying an edge that reminded me why defenders across the world had learned to fear his determination. "She wants me to ask permission to practice football in my own backyard. She wants committees to approve where I display trophies I earned through 20 years of dedication." He stood up, walking to the window where his World Cup trophy caught the morning Miami sunshine. "In Argentina we have a saying, el que no arriesga no gana. He who doesn't risk, doesn't win. This woman thinks she can make me risk nothing by forcing me to hide everything I've achieved." But Leo's response wasn't anger. It was strategic brilliance disguised as generous community engagement. That afternoon he called a press conference in his backyard. Standing in front of the training area that had caused so much controversy, with the World Cup trophy gleaming on a table beside him, Leo addressed the media circus with the same calm precision he'd used to dismantle defenses for 2 decades. "Football has given me everything," he began in English, his accent carrying the warmth that had charmed interviews worldwide. "Trophies, records, memories that will last forever. But the most beautiful part of football is sharing it with others, especially children who dream of achieving something special." He gestured toward his modest training setup. "This is where I practice, because football never stops. It is not a commercial facility. It is where a father teaches his sons, where an athlete maintains his fitness, where dreams continue even after you achieve them." The masterstroke came when Leo announced his response to the HOA's demands. Instead of fighting the new regulations, he was donating $500,000 to create a public soccer facility for Miami children, complete with professional coaching staff and equipment that would serve thousands of kids who couldn't afford private instruction. "If my neighbors believe my success creates problems, then I will share that success with the entire community," Leo said, his words carrying the quiet dignity that had made him a global icon beyond sports. "The beautiful game belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford gated communities." The press conference was carried live on ESPN, CNN, and sports networks around the world. But the moment that would define the story came during the Q&A session, when a reporter asked Leo directly about the HOA president's campaign against him. "Mr. Messi, how do you respond to allegations that your training activities and trophy displays violate community standards?" Leo paused, looking directly into the camera with the intensity that had terrorized goalkeepers for 20 years. "In my career, I have learned that some people try to diminish others' success because they cannot achieve it themselves. This is not about noise or glare or community standards. This is about someone who sees joy and excellence and wants to regulate it because it makes them uncomfortable." His final words carried the weight of someone who'd overcome every obstacle football could present. "I will not hide my achievements to make others feel better about their failures. The World Cup trophy stays in my window because it represents not just my dreams but the dreams of every child who believes impossible things can come true." The international response was immediate and overwhelming. Football federations from around the world issued statements supporting Leo. FIFA's president called the HOA's demands an insult to the beautiful game and its greatest practitioner. Even the president of Argentina tweeted his support for Leo's right to display his achievements. But the response that would prove most significant came from an unexpected source: the other residents of Platinum Heights. Led by families who'd attended Saturday's barbecue, a counter-petition began circulating demanding the complete removal of the current HOA board and a comprehensive audit of community finances. Within 24 hours, they'd gathered signatures from 78% of the residents, a devastating rebuke of the leadership that had ruled their community through fear and bureaucratic intimidation. The financial revelations continued to unfold. Tuesday evening brought news that the FBI had opened a preliminary investigation into HOA financial practices after multiple complaints about missing funds and discriminatory enforcement. The investigation would examine potential civil rights violations and financial fraud related to the mysterious consulting contracts. Wednesday morning's Miami Herald featured another bombshell investigation. Maria Santos had obtained internal HOA emails that revealed the true motivation behind the campaign against Leo. In a message to board members, the HOA president had written, "Messi's presence attracts the wrong element to our community. His success story sends the message that foreign athletes can succeed in America without adopting American values. We need to establish boundaries before other international celebrities think they can flaunt their achievements in our neighborhood." The email continued with language that made the discriminatory intent undeniable. The children at his barbecue were speaking Spanish, and Argentine customs were being celebrated. This is not what Platinum Heights residents signed up for. We must protect our community's American character. The civil rights implications were staggering. Federal investigators immediately recognized the emails as evidence of systematic discrimination based on national origin. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division announced they were reviewing the case for potential prosecution under federal housing discrimination laws. But the personal cost to the HOA president was mounting even faster than the legal problems. Her property management company lost 6 major contracts after the discriminatory emails became public. Her membership at the exclusive Coral Gables Country Club was suspended pending a review of her conduct. Even her own neighbors began avoiding her, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd become a symbol of suburban xenophobia. The woman who'd tried to silence the world's greatest footballer had succeeded only in amplifying her own bigotry to a global audience. Thursday brought the news that would ultimately destroy her completely. The Miami-Dade County District Attorney's Office announced they were launching a criminal investigation into HOA financial irregularities, including potential embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The missing $340,000 in reserve funds wasn't just poor financial management, it was systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. The consulting contracts that had drained the community's emergency funds were elaborate shell companies designed to funnel homeowner dues into personal accounts. But the investigation revealed something even more sinister. The HOA president had been using community funds to finance private investigators who conducted background checks on residents she considered problematic. Hispanic families, single mothers, and residents who'd questioned board decisions were subjected to surveillance that included credit checks, employment verification, and even investigation of their children's school activities. The surveillance apparatus she'd built to control her community had cost residents over $50,000 in unauthorized expenses. The money that should have been maintaining common areas and building reserves had instead been spent on a paranoid control system designed to eliminate anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. Friday morning's revelation completed the destruction of her credibility. The Miami Herald obtained financial records showing that the HOA president had used community funds to pay for her own legal defense against previous discrimination complaints. The $28,000 in legal fees had been disguised as community relations consulting and approved by a board that included her brother-in-law and country club friends. The pattern was clear. A corrupt HOA president had turned a luxury community into her personal fiefdom, using resident dues to finance discrimination, surveillance, and personal legal protection. Leo's World Cup trophy wasn't a violation of community standards, it was evidence of success that threatened her carefully constructed system of suburban authoritarianism. The irony was perfect. The woman who demanded Leo hide his achievements had spent years hiding her own crimes. The transparency she'd tried to prevent in his trophy display was exactly what exposed her systematic fraud and discrimination. By Friday afternoon, the HOA board had received resignation demands from 94% of Platinum Heights residents. The FBI had seized financial records. The State Insurance Commission was investigating liability coverage for communities with documented discriminatory practices. Civil rights attorneys were preparing class action lawsuits on behalf of targeted families. But the final blow came from the community's insurance company. Faced with documented discrimination and federal civil rights investigations, they immediately canceled the HOA's liability coverage. Without insurance, the community couldn't function legally. Property values would plummet. The monthly fees that financed the suburban paradise would become worthless. The woman who tried to protect property values through discriminatory enforcement had destroyed them through criminal corruption. Saturday brought the end. At an emergency community meeting, the HOA president submitted her resignation in a letter that would become a masterpiece of deflection and self-pity. After careful consideration, and in light of the media circus that has unfairly targeted our community's reasonable standards, I am stepping down as HOA president. The coordinated attack on our community values by outside agitators and international media has made effective leadership impossible. The letter continued with breathtaking lack of self-awareness. I have dedicated years of my life to protecting Platinum Heights from influences that threaten our way of life. History will vindicate my efforts to maintain the standards that make our community special. Her final paragraph revealed the delusion that had driven her campaign. I leave knowing that I stood up for American values against those who would transform our neighborhoods into something foreign and incompatible with our culture. The community meeting lasted 3 minutes. Her resignation was accepted unanimously without discussion. The new interim board's first act was authorizing a complete financial audit in cooperation with all federal investigations. But for Leo, the victory was about more than defeating an authoritarian HOA president. The controversy had sparked a national conversation about suburban discrimination and the weaponization of community standards against minorities and immigrants. Sunday morning found Leo in his backyard, practicing free kicks while his sons chased footballs around the training area that had caused so much trouble. The World Cup trophy gleamed in his living room window, visible to anyone who cared to look. I watched him from the patio, marveling at how someone could face down the most hostile crowds in football, but maintain such grace when confronting suburban bigotry. His response hadn't been anger or retaliation. It had been generosity and transparency that exposed his opponent's true character. "Sebastian," he called out after bending a perfect free kick into the top corner of his practice goal, "did you see the news about the youth soccer facility?" I had. The $500,000 donation he'd announced had attracted matching funds from other professional athletes, corporations, and community organizations. What started as a gesture of generosity had become a $2.3 million state-of-the-art facility that would serve thousands of Miami children. "The grand opening is next month," Leo continued, juggling a football with the casual perfection that never ceased to amaze me. "We should invite all the neighborhood children, even the ones whose parents tried to ban football from their lives." That was Leo, finding ways to transform conflict into community, using success to lift others rather than exclude them. The HOA president had tried to force him to hide his achievements. Instead, he'd used them to create opportunities for thousands of children who shared his dreams. The legal reckoning was swift and merciless. Federal prosecutors filed charges for civil rights violations, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The state attorney general brought criminal charges for embezzlement and abuse of fiduciary duty. Civil rights organizations filed federal lawsuits seeking damages for the systematic discrimination that had poisoned the community for years. But the personal destruction was even more complete. The woman who'd ruled Platinum Heights through fear and bureaucratic intimidation found herself facing federal prison, financial ruin, and social exile. Her property management company declared bankruptcy. Her country club membership was permanently revoked. Former friends avoided her calls. The morning news shows that had once given her platforms to defend community standards now featured legal experts analyzing her criminal charges and civil rights violations. The same media attention she'd tried to prevent Leo from receiving had become the instrument of her own destruction. Monday morning brought the final irony. Leo received a letter from the new HOA board, written on community letterhead and signed by residents who'd supported his right to live freely in his own home. "Dear Mr. Messi, on behalf of the Platinum Heights community, we apologize for the shameful treatment you and your family received from our previous leadership. Your grace, generosity, and dignity throughout this ordeal have shown us the true meaning of community values. We are honored to have you as our neighbor and grateful for the example you've set for our children." The letter concluded with an invitation. "We would be delighted if you would consider serving as our honorary community ambassador, helping us rebuild the spirit of welcome and inclusion that should define any neighborhood fortunate enough to call itself home to the world's greatest footballer." Leo's response was characteristically perfect. He accepted the honorary position and announced that his first official act would be hosting monthly soccer clinics for neighborhood children, teaching them not just football skills but the values of respect, inclusion, and community that transcend any sport. The saga that began with demands to hide his achievements had ended with an invitation to share them more widely. The woman who'd tried to exclude and intimidate had been replaced by leadership that celebrated and included, but perhaps the most beautiful outcome was the simplest. Every morning when I arrived at Leo's house, I could see the World Cup trophy gleaming in his living room window, catching the Miami sunshine and sending light throughout the community, No one complained about the glare anymore. The Monday morning after the former HOA president's resignation, I arrived at Leo's house to find federal agents setting up a command center in the Platinum Heights Community Clubhouse. What had started as a neighborhood dispute over trophy displays had evolved into one of the largest HOA fraud investigations in Florida history. Agent Patricia Rodriguez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division had been monitoring the case since the discriminatory emails surfaced. A 20-year veteran of financial crime investigations, she'd seen enough HOA corruption to recognize the patterns immediately. The combination of missing funds, discriminatory enforcement, and systematic surveillance indicated a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple community management. "Mr. Torres," Agent Rodriguez said when I met her at the clubhouse, "your employer's situation inadvertently exposed what we believe is a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. The former president wasn't just targeting Mr. Messi. She was using the HOA as a vehicle for systematic theft and money laundering." The scope of the investigation was staggering. Federal agents had seized computers, financial records, and communications dating back 5 years. What they discovered painted a picture of criminal sophistication that would have impressed organized crime prosecutors. The consulting contracts that had drained $340,000 from community reserves were just the visible portion of a much larger scheme. Peninsula Property Services, the shell company owned by the former president's brother-in-law, had been billing the HOA for services that were never performed while simultaneously providing those same services to other communities at legitimate rates. But the money laundering operation was even more elaborate. The former president had established a network of interconnected companies that inflated repair costs, charged premium rates for basic maintenance, and created fictional emergency expenses that justified transferring large sums from HOA accounts to personal use. She turned the entire community into her personal ATM, Agent Rodriguez explained, spreading financial documents across the clubhouse conference table. Residents thought they were paying for community improvements. Instead, they were funding a lifestyle that included a $180,000 luxury car, a vacation home in the Bahamas, and private school tuition for her children. The surveillance apparatus she'd built was equally criminal. Using HOA funds, she'd hired private investigators to conduct background checks on residents she considered problematic. The investigations included financial monitoring, employment verification, and even surveillance of family activities. The targeted families were almost exclusively Hispanic, single mothers or residents who'd questioned board decisions. The surveillance reports contained detailed profiles that read like intelligence dossiers compiled by someone obsessed with maintaining demographic control over her community. The surveillance of Mr. Messi was just the latest escalation, Agent Rodriguez continued. She'd been systematically monitoring and harassing minority residents for years, using HOA authority to mask what was essentially stalking and intimidation. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The former president had been sharing surveillance information with other HOA presidents across South Florida, creating an informal network of community leaders who exchanged intelligence about residents they considered undesirable. The network included HOA presidents from 8 luxury communities who met monthly to discuss problem residents and coordinate enforcement strategies. They developed a blacklist of contractors, residents, and even children who were considered threats to community standards. Leo's addition to their surveillance network had been inevitable. A high-profile Hispanic celebrity who attracted media attention and celebrated non-American cultural traditions represented everything their informal cartel opposed. The criminal charges filed Tuesday morning reflected the scope of the conspiracy. The former president faced federal charges for mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, civil rights violations, and racketeering. Her brother-in-law and 3 other HOA board members were charged with conspiracy and fraud, but the state charges were equally serious. The Florida Attorney General's office filed criminal complaints for grand theft, abuse of fiduciary duty, and violation of fair housing laws. The combined federal and state charges carried potential sentences exceeding 30 years in prison. The civil lawsuits began immediately. Families who'd been targeted for discriminatory enforcement filed federal civil rights complaints, seeking damages for harassment, discrimination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The class action lawsuit eventually included 47 families from 6 different communities. But the financial reckoning extended beyond criminal penalties. The community's insurance company had canceled all coverage upon learning of the discrimination and fraud. Property values plummeted as prospective buyers discovered the community was uninsurable due to criminal liability. The bonding company that had guaranteed the HOA's fiduciary responsibilities demanded immediate restitution of stolen funds. When the former president couldn't provide the money, they placed liens on her personal property and initiated foreclosure proceedings on her luxury home. Wednesday brought another devastating revelation. The Miami Herald's continued investigation revealed that the former president had been operating similar schemes in 3 previous communities before arriving at Platinum Heights. In each case, the pattern was identical. She'd run for HOA president, promising to upgrade community standards and property values. Once elected, she'd implement increasingly strict enforcement targeting minority residents while simultaneously establishing shell companies that drained community funds. The previous communities had lost a combined $1.8 million to her various schemes. In each case, she'd left just ahead of investigations, moving to new communities where her criminal background wasn't known. "She's a serial community predator," explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a criminologist at the University of Miami who'd been studying HOA fraud patterns. She identified wealthy communities with vulnerable governance structures and systematically exploited them through a combination of discrimination, intimidation, and financial theft. The psychological profile that emerged was classic white-collar criminal behavior combined with racial animus and narcissistic personality traits. She'd weaponized legitimate community governance tools to create her own fiefdom where she could control demographics, extract wealth, and punish anyone who challenged her authority. Leo's case had provided the visibility that finally exposed her criminal enterprise. The international media attention she'd tried to avoid had instead illuminated every aspect of her systematic fraud and discrimination. Thursday's development provided the missing piece of the criminal puzzle. Federal investigators discovered she'd been receiving payments from a property development company that was attempting to acquire Platinum Heights for commercial redevelopment. The harassment of long-term residents wasn't just about maintaining demographic control, it was about forcing property sales that would facilitate a corporate buyout. Each family that left due to discriminatory enforcement reduced community opposition to redevelopment while increasing her personal commissions from the development company. The scheme was breathtakingly cynical. She'd been systematically destroying the community she was elected to protect in order to profit from its ultimate elimination. The residents who trusted her with their property values and quality of life had been funding their own displacement. Leo's high profile and strong financial position made him immune to the harassment that had forced other families to leave. His refusal to be intimidated had exposed the entire criminal enterprise and saved the community from corporate acquisition. The development company faced its own federal investigation for conspiracy and fraud. Internal emails revealed they'd been coordinating with corrupt HOA presidents across South Florida to facilitate community acquisitions through manufactured controversies and discriminatory enforcement. Friday brought the first guilty plea. The former president's brother-in-law agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony revealed the full scope of the money laundering operation and implicated 2 additional HOA presidents in similar schemes. The cooperation agreement required him to provide detailed testimony about the surveillance network, the development company conspiracy, and the systematic discrimination that had targeted dozens of families across multiple communities. But perhaps most damaging was his testimony about the former president's explicit racial motivations. In recorded conversations, she'd expressed her belief that Hispanic families didn't understand American community values and needed to be managed more strictly to prevent neighborhoods from losing their character. The recordings provided prosecutors with clear evidence of discriminatory intent that would support federal civil rights charges carrying substantial prison sentences. The weekend brought a devastating media expose that completed the destruction of her public reputation. The Miami Herald published a comprehensive investigation titled "The HOA Queen: How One Woman Built a Criminal Empire Through Suburban Racism." The article included interviews with families from all 4 communities she'd targeted, revealing a decade-long pattern of discrimination, theft, and community destruction. The personal stories were heartbreaking: elderly residents forced from homes they'd owned for decades, young families bankrupted by fraudulent fines, children who'd been surveilled and harassed for speaking Spanish in their own neighborhoods. But the article also celebrated the heroes who'd stood up to her tyranny. Leo's story anchored the piece, but it included dozens of other families who'd resisted her harassment despite lacking his resources and international platform. The investigation revealed that Leo's visibility had inspired other victims to come forward. Families who'd been afraid to challenge her authority found courage in his example of dignified resistance to suburban authoritarianism. Monday morning brought the news that would define her ultimate punishment. Federal prosecutors announced they were seeking the maximum sentence under the RICO statute, treating her HOA fraud operation as organized crime equivalent to traditional racketeering enterprises. The RICO charges carried potential life imprisonment and complete asset forfeiture. Every dollar she'd stolen, every property she'd acquired through fraud, every luxury she'd purchased with community funds would be seized and returned to her victims. But the state charges provided additional accountability. Florida's hate crime statutes enhanced the penalties for her discriminatory enforcement, recognizing that her actions constituted systematic harassment based on race and national origin. The combined federal and state prosecutions would ensure she spent the rest of her life in prison while providing maximum restitution to the families she'd victimized. Tuesday brought Leo's testimony before the federal grand jury. As the victim whose case had exposed the entire criminal enterprise, his testimony would be crucial for establishing the discriminatory intent behind her actions. Leo approached the testimony with the same preparation and focus he'd brought to World Cup finals. He'd spent hours reviewing the timeline of harassment, the content of her demands, and the pattern of escalation that had culminated in her demands to hide his achievements. The prosecutor asked me to explain what it felt like to be told I couldn't display my World Cup trophy in my own home. Leo told me after the testimony. I said it felt like someone was trying to erase not just my success but my identity as an Argentine footballer who'd achieved something special. His testimony apparently moved several grand jurors to tears. The image of the world's greatest footballer being harassed for displaying his achievements perfectly captured the absurdity and cruelty of her criminal enterprise. The grand jury returned indictments on all federal charges Wednesday morning. The state grand jury followed with additional charges Thursday afternoon. The woman who tried to regulate Leo's success was now facing the full weight of American criminal justice. But the victory extended beyond individual accountability. The investigation had sparked federal legislation requiring transparency in HOA financial operations and federal oversight of communities with patterns of discriminatory enforcement. The Messi Act, as media outlets dubbed the proposed legislation, would create federal protections for HOA residents and criminal penalties for community leaders who abused their authority for personal gain or discriminatory purposes. Friday afternoon brought the final irony. Leo received an invitation to testify before Congress about HOA reform and the protection of immigrant rights in American communities. The man who'd been told to hide his achievements would now address the nation's lawmakers about the importance of inclusion, community spirit, and the American dream that had attracted him to make Miami his home. Sebastian, Leo said as we reviewed the congressional invitation, when I moved to America, I expected opportunity and freedom. I found both. But I also discovered that some people use rules and regulations to deny those same opportunities to others. He paused, looking out at the training area that had caused so much controversy but had ultimately exposed systematic criminality and community corruption. Perhaps this is the most important goal I will ever score. Not against a goalkeeper, but against the forces that try to exclude people from the communities where they've earned the right to belong. The woman who tried to force him to hide his success had instead elevated him to national leadership on issues of inclusion and immigrant rights. Her attempt to diminish his visibility had transformed him into a symbol of resistance against suburban authoritarianism. The criminal trials were scheduled for the following year, but the broader victory was already complete. A criminal enterprise that had operated for a decade had been destroyed. Dozens of families had received justice for years of harassment and discrimination. Federal legislation would protect future communities from similar abuse. But perhaps most importantly, the community that had been ruled by fear and exclusion had been transformed into a place of welcome and celebration. The monthly soccer clinics Leo hosted drew families from across Miami, creating the kind of genuine community spirit that no HOA regulation could manufacture. The World Cup trophy still gleamed in Leo's living room window, catching the Miami sunshine and sending light throughout a neighborhood that had learned to celebrate success rather than regulate it. No one complained about the glare anymore. Instead, children pressed their faces against the glass, dreaming of achieving something worthy of such beautiful illumination. 6 months after the criminal investigation began, I found myself sitting in the Hart Senate office building in Washington, D.C., watching Leo prepare for what would become one of the most important testimonies in HOA reform history. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who'd been told to hide his achievements was now addressing Congress about protecting immigrant rights and community inclusion. The Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights had called Leo to testify about discriminatory HOA practices and the need for federal oversight of community associations. His case had become the catalyst for nationwide reform efforts, transforming a local dispute into federal legislation that would protect millions of Americans from similar abuse. Senator Maria Gonzalez, the subcommittee chair, whose own parents had immigrated from Guatemala, had personally invited Leo to share his experience as an example of how American communities could either welcome or exclude newcomers based on the character of their leadership. "Mr. Messi," Senator Gonzalez said during their pre-hearing meeting, "your story represents both the best and worst of American community life. We need Congress to understand how HOA authority can be weaponized against success, against diversity, against the very dreams that bring people to our country." The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from around the world had come to witness Leo's congressional testimony. C-SPAN carried the proceedings live, while Spanish-language networks provided simultaneous translation for audiences across Latin America who wanted to hear their football hero address American lawmakers. But the most powerful presence in the room came from the dozens of HOA abuse victims who traveled to Washington to support the reform legislation. Families from across the country who'd experienced similar harassment, discrimination, and financial exploitation filled the gallery, their faces reflecting years of frustration finally getting national attention. Leo's testimony began with characteristic humility and precision. Wearing a simple navy suit rather than his usual casual attire, he spoke directly to the senators with the same calm confidence he'd shown during World Cup finals. "Honorable Senators, my name is Lionel Messi. I am a professional footballer, a husband, a father of 3 boys, and a proud new resident of the United States. I come before you today not as a celebrity seeking attention, but as an immigrant who has experienced both the welcome and the exclusion that characterize American communities." He paused, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd overcome every obstacle football could present. "When I moved my family to Miami, we sought the same things that bring millions of people to America: opportunity, security, and the chance to contribute to a community that values excellence and hard work." The subcommittee listened intently as Leo described the escalating harassment campaign, the demands to hide his achievements, and the systematic discrimination that the investigation had revealed. But his testimony transcended individual grievances to address broader questions about community governance and immigrant integration. "The former HOA president didn't object to my success because it violated noise ordinances or aesthetic standards," Leo continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in locker rooms worldwide. "She objected because my success was visible, because it celebrated non-American achievements, because it reminded her that immigrants could achieve things she never could." Senator James Patterson, a Republican from Texas who'd initially been skeptical of federal HOA oversight, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Messi, some might argue that HOA regulations are necessary to protect property values and community standards. How do we distinguish between legitimate governance and discriminatory harassment?" Leo's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him football's greatest playmaker. "Senator, legitimate governance applies rules equally to all residents. Discriminatory harassment targets specific families while ignoring identical violations by favored residents. The investigation revealed that Hispanic families in my community received violation notices at 3 times the rate of white families for the same infractions." He gestured toward the evidence displays that federal prosecutors had provided to illustrate the systematic nature of the discrimination. This was not about community standards. This was about community control, determining who belongs and who doesn't, based on race, nationality, and visibility of success. Senator Gonzalez asked the question that would define the hearing's impact. "What changes do you believe Congress should make to protect other families from similar abuse?" Leo's response had been carefully prepared with input from civil rights attorneys, HOA reform advocates, and immigrant rights organizations. His recommendations would form the foundation of the legislation that would eventually bear his name. First, mandatory transparency in HOA financial operations with federal oversight of communities that receive tax benefits or insurance subsidies. The missing funds in my community could have been prevented with basic accountability measures. Second, federal civil rights protections that specifically address HOA discrimination. Current fair housing laws don't adequately address the subtle harassment that drives families from their homes through selective enforcement and manufactured violations. Third, criminal penalties for HOA leaders who abuse their authority for personal gain or discriminatory purposes. The woman who harassed my family stole hundreds of thousands of dollars while systematically targeting minority residents. This behavior should carry federal criminal consequences. His final recommendation drew the loudest applause from the gallery. And fourth, protection for residents who speak out against HOA abuse. Too many families suffer in silence because they fear retaliation. Whistleblower protections would encourage reporting of discrimination and financial misconduct. The questioning continued for 2 hours, with senators from both parties recognizing the bipartisan appeal of HOA reform. Conservative senators appreciated the financial accountability measures, while liberal senators supported the civil rights protections. But the most powerful testimony came from other witnesses who'd experienced similar abuse. Maria Santos, the Miami Herald reporter who'd exposed the corruption, testified about the nationwide patterns she'd discovered in her investigation. Messi's case is not unique, Santos testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent months documenting systematic abuse. I have identified similar schemes in 43 states involving over 200 HOA presidents who used community authority to facilitate discrimination, theft, and personal enrichment. She presented data showing that HOA discrimination complaints had increased 340% over the past decade, with Hispanic families, Asian families, and single mothers experiencing disproportionate targeting for violations. The pattern was so consistent across different regions that it suggested coordinated strategies rather than isolated incidents. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the University of Miami criminologist, provided academic context that elevated the discussion beyond individual cases to broader questions of community governance and democratic accountability. HOA presidents often exercise more direct authority over residents' daily lives than elected officials, Dr. Mitchell testified, yet they operate with minimal oversight, financial transparency, or civil rights protections. This combination of power and lack of accountability creates opportunities for the kind of abuse we've witnessed. But the testimony that moved senators to tears came from Rosa Martinez, an elderly widow from Phoenix, whose family had been driven from their home by HOA harassment, similar to what Leo had experienced. "Senators, my husband built our house with his own hands over 30 years ago," Mrs. Martinez testified in heavily accented English, her voice trembling with emotion. "We raised 4 children there. We paid our taxes, maintained our property, and tried to be good neighbors." She described how a new HOA president had targeted her family with increasingly absurd violations: citations for her vegetable garden, fines for her grandchildren's playground equipment, and demands to remove religious decorations that had been displayed for decades. "They made our life so miserable that we had to sell our home for half its value just to escape the harassment," she continued, tears streaming down her weathered face. "We lost our life savings, our community, our children's inheritance, all because someone decided we didn't belong in the neighborhood we'd called home for 30 years. Mrs. Martinez's story illustrated the human cost of HOA abuse beyond the high-profile cases that generated media attention. Her family had lacked Leo's resources and international platform, making them vulnerable to the kind of systematic harassment that destroyed lives through bureaucratic warfare. The hearing's turning point came when Senator Patterson, the Texas Republican who'd initially been skeptical, asked Leo directly about the American dream and immigrant integration. "Mr. Messi, you've achieved extraordinary success in your career and could live anywhere in the world. Why is it important to you that America protects immigrant families from this kind of harassment?" Leo's response captured the moral clarity that had made him a global icon beyond sports. "Senator, America has given me opportunities to achieve dreams I never thought possible. But the American dream means nothing if it's only available to people who already have power and privilege." He gestured toward Mrs. Martinez in the gallery. "Mrs. Martinez's family deserves the same protections as mine. Her grandchildren deserve the same security as my sons. The only difference between our cases is that my visibility made the harassment harder to ignore." His voice carried the passion that had driven him to overcome every obstacle in football. "I could afford lawyers and media attention. Most families cannot. If America is going to live up to its promise of opportunity for all, then all families must be protected from those who would use community authority to exclude and intimidate." The committee voted unanimously to advance the HOA Reform and Accountability Act to the full Senate. The legislation included all of Leo's recommendations, plus additional protections for elderly residents, disabled families, and military personnel who'd been disproportionately targeted by discriminatory enforcement. But the hearing's impact extended beyond legislative reform. Leo's testimony had been carried live on Spanish-language networks across Latin America, where millions of viewers witnessed their football hero addressing the highest levels of American government with dignity and moral authority. The contrast with his treatment by the HOA president was stark and powerful. The woman who tried to silence him had instead elevated him to national leadership on issues of inclusion and immigrant rights. Thursday brought news that the House of Representatives would hold parallel hearings on HOA reform, with Leo invited to provide similar testimony. The momentum for federal legislation was building rapidly, driven by the visibility his case had created and the systematic abuse that investigations had revealed. But perhaps more importantly, communities across the country were using Leo's example to challenge their own HOA abuses. Civil rights organizations reported a 500% increase in discrimination complaints as families found courage to speak out against harassment they'd previously endured in silence. The Friday afternoon development that would define Leo's lasting impact came from an unexpected source. The United Nations Human Rights Council invited him to address their Committee on Housing Discrimination and Immigrant Rights, recognizing his testimony as an example of how celebrity platforms could advance human rights causes. "Sebastian," Leo said as we reviewed the UN invitation, "when I was a child in Rosario, I dreamed of playing in World Cups and winning trophies. I never imagined I would address world leaders about protecting families from discrimination." He paused, looking at the World Cup trophy that had started the entire controversy, still gleaming in its place of honor in our Miami living room. "Perhaps this is more important than any goal I've ever scored. Goals win matches, but protecting people's right to belong in their communities changes lives." The weekend brought the final irony that completed the transformation of Leo's harassment into global advocacy. FIFA announced they were establishing the Messi Foundation for Community Inclusion, a global initiative to combat housing discrimination and promote immigrant integration through sports-based community programs. The foundation's first project would be building soccer facilities in underserved communities across the United States, providing safe spaces where children could pursue their dreams regardless of their family's immigration status or economic circumstances. Monday morning brought confirmation that the Senate would vote on the HOA Reform Act within the month. Early vote counts suggested overwhelming bipartisan support, with senators recognizing that HOA accountability appealed to both fiscal conservatives and civil rights advocates. But the personal victory that mattered most to Leo came from much closer to home. The Platinum Heights community had transformed from a place ruled by fear and exclusion into a model of inclusion and celebration. The monthly soccer clinics he hosted drew families from across Miami, creating genuine community bonds that transcended the artificial barriers the former president had tried to maintain. Children who'd been afraid to speak Spanish in public now proudly taught their friends Argentine football songs. Property values had recovered and exceeded their previous highs, as the community's reputation for inclusion attracted families who valued diversity and authentic community spirit over manufactured exclusivity. The woman who'd tried to hide Leo's achievements to protect property values had actually enhanced them by providing an example of how communities could overcome discrimination and embrace their best angels. Tuesday evening brought Leo's final appearance on the case that had transformed him from athlete to advocate. The CBS Evening News featured him in a primetime special about immigration, community, and the American dream. "Mr. Messi," the anchor asked, "how has this experience changed your perspective on America and your role in American society?" Leo's response captured the wisdom he'd gained from confronting suburban authoritarianism with grace and determination. "This experience taught me that America's greatness comes not from excluding people who are different, but from including them and learning from their contributions." He gestured toward footage of children playing soccer in the facility his foundation had built. "When we create communities where everyone can belong and contribute, we don't just protect individual families, we strengthen the entire society." The special concluded with images of the congressional hearing, the community transformation in Platinum Heights, and children from around the world watching their hero address lawmakers about protecting their rights. The woman who demanded Leo hide his World Cup trophy had instead inspired him to display something even more valuable, moral leadership that transcended sports, to address fundamental questions of human dignity and community inclusion. The trophy still gleamed in his living room window, catching the Miami sunshine and reflecting light throughout a neighborhood that had learned to celebrate rather than regulate success. But now it shared space with something even more precious: letters from families across the country who'd found courage in Leo's example to stand up to their own community tyrants and fight for their right to belong. The glare the former president had complained about had become a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't fit their community's standards of acceptability. 8 months after her arrest, the woman who'd once terrorized Platinum Heights through bureaucratic warfare sat in federal court facing the consequences of her criminal enterprise. The trial of United States v. Karen Whitmore became one of the most watched HOA corruption cases in American history, broadcast live and followed by millions worldwide. Judge Margaret Chen presided over proceedings that would set legal precedents for HOA accountability. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records showing $400,000 in systematic theft, recorded conversations revealing discriminatory intent, and testimony from dozens of victimized families. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Rosa Martinez, the elderly widow from Phoenix, testified about losing her generational home to harassment that began when she questioned excessive fees. Miguel Santos described selective enforcement that drove his family into near bankruptcy, while identical violations were ignored at white neighbors' properties. But Leo's testimony defined the trial's moral center. Taking the witness stand with the same composure he'd shown in World Cup finals, he described the escalating harassment campaign with precision that left the courtroom silent. The defendant demanded I remove my World Cup trophy from my living room window because she claimed it created excessive glare. Leo testified, his accented English carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. But the real problem wasn't glare. The real problem was that my success was visible to the community she was trying to control. The defense's strategy of portraying her as an overwhelmed volunteer collapsed when prosecutors played recorded conversations where she'd explicitly discussed targeting families based on race and nationality. In one particularly damaging recording, she'd told a board member, "These people don't understand American community values. We need to make them uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily." Years of Facebook posts revealed deep-seated prejudices, while private messages to other HOA presidents showed coordination with a regional discrimination network sharing information about problem residents. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges: conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, civil rights violations, and racketeering under RICO. The unanimous verdicts reflected overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal enterprise. The trial became a viral phenomenon transcending legal proceedings. TikTok exploded with videos analyzing her courtroom demeanor, generating over 100 million views. The most viral moment showed security footage of her rolling her eyes during Leo's testimony about the World Cup trophy demand. The optics were devastating: a convicted criminal displaying continued arrogance while facing life imprisonment. The #MyHOA Story hashtag generated over 50,000 posts from families describing similar harassment, creating a national database of community abuse that would drive federal reform legislation. Judge Chen's sentencing reflected both crime severity and the need for civil rights deterrence. The defendant received 40 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, plus complete asset forfeiture to compensate victims. Ms. Whitmore, Judge Chen declared, "You abused community trust to facilitate systematic theft and discrimination. Your sentence reflects not just individual crimes, but the need to protect all American communities from those who would use authority to facilitate hatred and exclusion." Footage of her being led away in handcuffs while victims celebrated became the year's most watched criminal justice content, shared millions of times as a symbol of accountability for suburban authoritarianism. But the real victory extended far beyond individual punishment. The HOA Reform and Accountability Act passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing federal oversight of community associations and criminal penalties for discriminatory enforcement. Leo's congressional testimony had sparked legislation protecting millions of American families from similar abuse. His foundation built soccer facilities in underserved communities nationwide, while the UN Human Rights Council invited him to address housing discrimination globally. Platinum Heights itself transformed from a community ruled by fear into a model of inclusion. Property values reached record highs as families sought neighborhoods known for welcoming rather than excluding success. The monthly soccer clinics Leo hosted drew participants from across Miami, creating authentic community bonds no regulation could manufacture. The most beautiful irony came full circle every morning when I arrived at Leo's house. The World Cup trophy still gleamed in his living room window, catching Miami sunshine and sending light throughout a neighborhood that had learned to celebrate achievements rather than regulate them. No one complained about the glare anymore. Instead, tour buses regularly passed the house, where visitors glimpsed the trophy that sparked a revolution in HOA accountability and immigrant rights. Children pressed their faces against the glass, dreaming of achieving something worthy of such beautiful illumination. The woman who demanded Leo hide his success had instead inspired him to display something even more valuable: the transformative power of dignified resistance against those who abuse authority for personal gain. Her attempt to exclude had created inclusion. Her effort to silence had amplified voices for justice. Her suburban tyranny had become a catalyst for federal civil rights protection. Leo's final statement to me captured the profound transformation his ordeal had achieved. "Sebastian, when I moved to America, I expected to find opportunity and freedom. I found both, but I also discovered that sometimes you must fight to protect those opportunities for others who don't have platforms to defend themselves." He gestured toward the training area that had caused so much controversy but ultimately exposed systematic criminality. Perhaps this was more important than any goal I ever scored. Goals win matches, but protecting people's right to belong in their communities changes lives forever. The greatest footballer in history had scored his most important goal not against a goalkeeper, but against the forces that try to exclude people from communities where they've earned the right to belong. The World Cup winner had won something even more precious: a victory for human dignity that would protect families for generations to come. The trophy continued to shine in the window, no longer a violation of community standards, but a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever been told their success was too bright, their culture too foreign, or their dreams too visible for someone else's comfort. Justice had been served, legacy had been built, and the beautiful game had once again proven that football's greatest victories happen not just on the pitch, but in the communities where the sport's values of inclusion, respect, and celebration transform hearts and minds.